good morning to all of you tuning in, or good evening, depending on what time zone or continent you may be in right now. I'm Jesse Starita, Public Relations and Engagement Coordinator with the Nebraska Water Center, and we are based here at the University of Nebraska. And I'd like to welcome everyone to the Water for Food Global Forum. This is week 3, so I hope you've had a chance to participate in previous sessions and weeks. And this morning, I'm really excited to present a session called Collaboration in Action, Bazile Groundwater Management Project. And not Brazil, but Bazile. This is a Nebraska-focused project. So in Northeast Nebraska, a coalition of local, state, tribal, and federal agencies have come together to conduct research and outreach to address rising nitrate levels in groundwater. This session will focus on how the group came together, what research and outreach is being conducted, and the impacts that these efforts are having in the region. Since these talks all share aspects of the same project and are interrelated, we're going to hold off on questions until after all of the presenters have shared. So first up, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Crystal Powers, who is a busy person these days. She's from the Nebraska Water Center, representing the Nebraska Water Center, the Doherty Water for Food Global Institute, and University of Nebraska Extension. And Crystal will really lay the groundwork in her presentation for what the Bazile Groundwater Management Area is. So with that, over to Crystal.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I get the pleasure of kicking off this group, and I really want to say I'm speaking for a very large group of people that I'll introduce here, that we've just had a small part in helping coordinate around the Bazile Groundwater Management Area. So what I'm going to cover is kind of introduce you to the whole group, who's doing what, and then how the project kind of got started and how it's structured, and then talk about kind of the methods behind what is being done in the area. So just spatially, to think about where we're at, so this is the state of Nebraska. Maybe since this is global, I should have zoomed in from the US. So Nebraska is right in the center of the US. And this is a map of the average nitrate levels in the groundwater. So we have a lot of groundwater in our state, which is really a benefit. Unfortunately, we've had this growing challenge of rising levels. Oh dear, we're in automatic. Any rate, and so in this map, 10 parts per million is the EPA maximum contaminant level for drinking water. So that's the dark orange. So anything in dark orange and the purples are above safe drinking water levels, and anything in the yellows is above background. And then Bazile is specifically up in this northeast corner where I kind of drew a blue box, if you can see it. And the map to the right shows the darker green circles. So this is a satellite image. The darker green circles are crop fields. The tannish areas kind of are more prevalent up in the upper left, that's pasture rangeland. And then the red these are the small communities that are in this region. So zooming in on a, what do I want to call it? But anyway, a map where you can see the towns. So we've got several small towns in this region. It makes an interesting and a little bit challenging policy piece because it covers 3 different counties within the state. So each of those counties have their own structure. We have 4 different natural resource districts. So you can see they roughly follow watersheds. So that's why we've got the Elkhorn Basin. So we've got upper and lower Elkhorn on the bottom, the Missouri River Basin and the Niobrara River Basin. So this is kind of a headwaters area, although it's very flat. And so then we've got all these small communities. So there's a lot of governmental structures overlaid in this single area. It's about 750 square miles. And so also just as a bit of background for who manages Nebraska's groundwater, who's on the governmental side responsible for different aspects. So at the local level, we have natural resource districts here in the state of Nebraska. These are governed by a locally elected board. They're roughly follow watershed boundaries. We have 23 in the state, and their funding is through local property tax. And they're responsible for groundwater extractions and permitting, as well as monitoring and regulating the quality of that groundwater. At the state level, we've got two different organizations, the Nebraska Department of Environment and Energy, which permits point sources, such as livestock, industrial, and municipal sources. It licenses chemigation, which is when we apply fertilizer or other agrochemicals through irrigation water. It permits injection wells, and it monitors and regulates groundwater and surface water quality as well. And then finally, the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services is another state agency who they are responsible for licensing, contracting, and enforcing well standards. And so these can be private wells or municipal wells. So for this specific area, the founding partners are kind of here at the top. We've got the 4 natural resource districts that cover the area Lewis and Clark, Lower Elkhorn, Upper Elkhorn, and Lower Niobrara are the 4 natural resource districts, the Department of Environment and Energy. And then the federal partners on the project are the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, as well as USDA, the Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS. I know we love our acronyms in water. And so these groups all came together to write a protection plan, which is the first in the nation to connect groundwater and surface water for non-point source pollution. So it's very innovative nationally in that sense. The University of Nebraska has been involved for some time on the monitoring side of monitoring the groundwater, and more recently has been partnered in our extension and outreach efforts, as well as bringing in our medical center colleagues looking at health impacts in the region. And then I myself, which I realize I didn't fully introduce myself, I work at the Nebraska Water Center, as well as the Doherty Water for Food Institute. And we've been helping do some coordination between the university and all these local partners. And then funding, which is always important. There's local, state, and federal funding from all these agencies, as well as our Nebraska Environmental Trust. So how do we organize all these folks internally to have impact? And so how do we make this network? If for those of you who watched some of the on-demand sessions, I talked more in depth about collective impact. And this is a process that I've been using here at the Water Center, but I think it fits very well with what these organizations have done on their own to get organized. Is they organize around a common agenda, shared measurement. So in this case, it's groundwater quality, and then reinforcing activities. So each of those organizations are doing activities that help work towards that goal. There's continuous communication and an organization behind all of that to keep them structured. So if we look a little bit more in depth on each of those as it applies to how they've done this through their management plan. So if you look at how they've come about getting to a common agenda and shared measurement, this was established in their plan, I think in about 2015, 2016, these groups came together to hash out what should be our shared goals. And so what they came up with was a short-term goal in the next 5 years. They want to, that the trend of rising concentrations would be halted. And then the second goal being in 20 years, we'd like to see, so they prioritized it by area, that there would be no public water supplies that were on administrative order, which means that their water is above the safe drinking limit. Then they also have a goal that in their tier 2 areas, which are around the communities, that the concentration will be reduced and maintained below that safe drinking water level. And finally, that the contamination and other non-point activities will no longer impair surface water uses. So that kind of shows there's this groundwater surface water interaction in this area, and they want to have impact on both. And then if we look at how they organize themselves and how they establish communication across the group, so they founded what they call the Bazile Steering Committee. This group meets every month and has all of the partners involved attend this meeting. And this is how they organize and keep each other up to date, because we have a lot of organizations involved. So, starting at the top, you'll see those 4 natural resource districts. There's the federal partners of NRCS and EPA who are involved at the state level, NDEE, DHHS, those groups that I introduced at the beginning, as well as some folks like Nebraska Game and Parks occasionally are involved. There is a tribal community who is just downstream of this area, the Santee Sioux Nation. They participate as well. And then there's the university partners. So then this is, I know you probably can't even read all of these little things, but this is to show all of all the activities that are going on. So this is, in that structure I was talking about, these are the reinforcing activities. So some of these, all the partners work on, some of them are individual programs of some of these partners. And the idea is just to see that then you can engage agriculture extensively. Down at the bottom, we've got those local communities. We're engaging nonprofits. And so these are ways that all of these programs can work towards that shared goal. And so then the last part I wanted to do is kind of this background piece is, how do we decide what we do? And so we're going to start to hone in on, we decided for this session to focus in on what we're doing in academia. And the kind of the theory behind this is that diffusion of innovation. And there again, I'll put a plug in for, if you haven't watched it yet, go check out the on-demand session. There's a whole talk on how this theory works. But how it looks for us at the university is, these are all the projects that we are doing from the academic side in this specific area to try to address this specific issue. And so we now have, after the organizing agencies kind of asked us to get involved, they might have got more than they bargained for. So now we've got 25 faculty doing several different projects, looking at nitrogen movement and fate and transport of that nitrogen in the environment. We've got several projects looking at fertilizer application, just getting started in that health aspects. And then we're looking at specific conservation practices and management practices. And then all of that kind of ties together with doing educational programming. So I won't go through this because it's done in that pre-session, but just the idea is that that there's a process that people go through to adopt different practices and how you communicate changes through that. So that kind of leads to our I'm going to do the high level of how we're doing outreach and extension in the area. So there's kind of 3 levels of knowledge, persuasion, and implementation. And I'll let the following speakers go into the details, but kind of at that knowledge level is where we have newsletter articles. The Bazile group as a whole has established a website and a social media presence. They put on meetings, which our extension educators assist with and provide educational content at the knowledge level. And then in that process, the middle phase is when people are trying to decide if they're going to use that innovation. So that's kind of things like field days and some of the educational meetings. Again, the newsletter articles can help do that, and the on-farm trials, which is what we're going to talk about several of these more. And then finally, when people get to the implementation of an innovation, they need to know how to do it. We put on events at that level as well. So things like our field days, how-to extension guides, and workshops can really help producers in the region start to implement things once they've decided they want to do it. So with that, I will stop and we'll hear more of the details of what all of this looks like from my colleagues.
Thank you so much, Crystal. So second up in our batting order this morning is Christopher Proctor, and he is an extension educator from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in the Department of Agronomy. And he's going to give a presentation about some of the innovative demo farms that are part and parcel of this project.
All right, that's great. Yeah, thank you, Jesse. Yeah, so I'm maybe dig a little deeper level than some of the things that Crystal was talking about, but I'm not going to talk in great detail about the specific projects because I know Jeremy's going to be doing that here in a minute. But so I wanted to take just a high level view of what are we doing demo farms? Why are we doing demo farms? What's the purpose, or why do we see the value in this on-farm research and demonstration? And so we have a program within the university that does this more broadly, and we call it the Nebraska On-Farm Research Network. And so I'm borrowing a little bit from that program, but we've really adopted some of those principles that have been really effective in that program, specifically for the Bazile area and some demo farms there. And so when we think about on-farm research, what's the value in it? And really it's that collaborative opportunity between producers who are managing cropland and everybody else who is kind of surrounding them and supporting them in what they do. And so really it gives an opportunity to work with growers for them to answer questions that they might have specifically for their farm, or in the Bazile case for that region. If there's questions that really need to be answered, can we do that on the farm itself and come up with very regionally specific practical answers to those questions? And so it's really a team of folks that work together, but it's all based on the farm itself, I think, which is really helpful and important. So on the one end of the spectrum, you have research information that's generated, and there's a lot of value to that. But if it's not taken and ultimately adopted by growers, it hasn't. I don't think we've seen all the value out of that research data that we might otherwise see. And so I think to be able to take this information that we're learning and understanding from research, and then see it actually adopted by growers, that would be the ultimate goal. And so for them to take some of these concepts and try them on their farm in what would be a relatively low risk environment, where they can test it out and see how it works without just wholesale trying to adopt a new practice all the way across their entire operation. They can do it specific, in a smaller scale. And so when you think, well, what's the impact of these projects or these on-farm projects? Really what we've seen broadly is it helps those producers evaluate those new practices and adopt those new practices. So it's a way for them to test that out on their farm. And every field's different. Every grower's equipment's a little bit different. There's all these different factors that go into it. And so I think it allows that kind of on the ground testing of these practices. What's interesting is a pretty high level of producers that have tested out different practices on their farm have ultimately adopted them. And I think the other really important piece to these demonstration research projects is it has an effect on the neighbors. So I think farmers talk amongst their peers, the neighbors as they drive by, they see these strips out in the field or these different research projects being implemented, and so they ask questions. And so I think just it's the sharing of that information within a community is the other real value, I think, of having these demonstration farms regionally located, as opposed to having it down at the university research center. So one of the other big pieces to the on-farm research that I think is really important, and especially for the Bazile region, I think this is something that is pretty important, is it allows farmers to have some hands-on experience and ways to test some of the new technologies that are coming out without having to go out and buy a whole new planter or buy an expensive drone, or there's all these new technologies that are are coming, and I think by collaborating with the university and farmers and other folks in agriculture, I think the farmers can see how these technologies work. They can test it out on their farm and decide, is this fit within my operation? Is this something that I could adopt and utilize within my operation, or does it not necessarily a good fit without having this large investment up front in the technology? So I think there's real value there from these projects. I thought this was helpful. I mean, it's really we kind of hinge on these as kind of the principles of this on-farm experimentation. So I think the fact that it's farmer-centric is really important. Within the U.S., our ag production systems are very farmer-centric, and so I think building these research and demonstration projects around growers, I think, is really important. I think the other big piece is they're to the scale of production. And so a lot of research is done small scale because we can test a lot of different ideas in a relatively small space. But ultimately, for a grower to adopt it, it needs to scale to the size of equipment that they're using. And so these on-farm demos are run at scale using farmer owned equipment. I think the fact that we work really hard to tie what they're seeing in these demos back to the data itself. So we want to help them design these demonstrations and research projects on their farm so that they can make informed decisions. So it's not, well, I think that that field looks a lot better this year doing this practice than it did last year. But we actually help them compare different practices side by side using statistics and some kind of experimental design so that they can use the data to actually make some of these decisions. I think it pulls in a lot of the experts. And so folks that are doing the research, I think they come alongside a lot of these projects and can add a lot of value to what the growers are doing and just insights. Growers have to be generalists. They have to be experts in a lot of different areas to do what they do. And so having folks that focus in on certain topics, I think, and then having them work alongside growers is something that's really important. And this co-learning idea, I think, is something that I think is really helpful as well. I say this frequently, that I learn as much working with growers as I hope maybe they might learn from me when I'm in the field. And so there's a lot of understanding, what do they do day in and day out, and what works for their system and what doesn't work. And can we then design our research programs and questions relative to what growers are doing. So there's kind of that two-way flow of information that I think is really important, and that scalability. So that's that idea that conversations are happening around these projects, and it's broader than just a single field on a single farm, but the impact is usually much broader than that. So here's just a picture of one of the demonstration projects that's happening up in the Bazile region. And this is just to show the scale of it. And so this project, we're doing it under a center pivot irrigation system, and you can see here's the pivot tracks, but these here are outlining some of the research plots that we have in the field. And so these plots are extremely large. This is a half the span of a pivot between the pivot tracks, and nearly 100 feet long is one of our plots. So this is much larger than what we would do at one of our research centers. And so almost all of this is done with farmer scaled equipment, and it's in a farmer's field. Talking about different technology that growers have access to. Here is a large, high clearance, what is a sprayer that's been adapted to plant cover crops into standing corn. And so this is a piece of equipment that the grower doesn't own, but was brought in by the project through the university in collaboration with the Department of Environment and Energy. And we're able to test this as part of this project on the grower's field. And so in this case, he was able to see it operating on his field, get an idea of what the value of something like this might be, decide, would this have some kind of fit in his operation going forward. And so there's opportunities like this, I think, that add real value to these demonstration projects. And then from a personal side, lastly, I just enjoy my office view being like this. So just to be out in the field and seeing some of the beautiful parts of our state and interacting with growers and just that collaborative effort, to me, there's a lot of value there. And so hopefully that's helpful just to give you an overview of how we think about these demonstration projects from kind of a high level view. And I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Chris. If nothing else, you've given me wanderlust to want to get out on the road and take in some of those beautiful sights. A quick public service announcement. I know we said we'd take questions at the end, and that is still the case, but if something comes to you as you're listening to these presentations, feel free to enter that into the Q&A, and we'll do our best to field those questions at the end. I just don't want people to lose good questions that they may have in the moment. So with that, we're going to turn and just kind of progressively get closer and closer to the field. And next up is Jeremy Milander, who's an extension educator with the Bazile Groundwater Management Area. And he will be presenting on some of the specific practices and findings at the demonstration farms.
Okay, so Chris talked a little bit about why we do these demonstration farms and why the On-Farm Research Network is here. I'm going to delve a little bit more into the details of one of the projects that we have. And for this project, we have 3 different demonstration and research farms and kind of scattered throughout the Bazile Groundwater Management Area. And funding for this was from a Nebraska Environmental Trust grant. And the way I look at these sites is we have 3 different sites all looking at the same issue of high nitrate and trying to prevent leaching, but we're looking at 3 different approaches to solve the same issue. So the 3 different approaches we're looking at, one approach being improving the soil health and using cover crops to do that. So making the soil, increasing its ability to retain that nitrate and prevent it from leaching, also having some cover crops there to intercept the nitrate before it gets to the groundwater. And then another site we are looking at a little bit more detailed nitrogen and irrigation management strategies as well, trying to reduce the nitrate load and really looking at that interaction between nitrogen management and irrigation management that is so crucial for this issue. And then the last site I'll talk about, we're talking about diversified crop rotation strategies. So this area has historically been dominated by either continuous corn or corn soybean rotation. So we're looking at trying to diversify that a little bit and trying to get away from some of the same of we've been doing that's been causing this issue, and trying to get away from the corn crop that has so much nitrogen, a lot more nitrogen inputs than other crops as well. So with that, I'll delve a little bit more into the details of each of these 3 specific sites separately. So the first site I'm going to talk about is the soil health focus site. So as I said before, we're looking at incorporation of cover crops into this site. One of the main things we're looking at with the incorporation of cover crops is timing of cover crop seeding. So we want our cover crops to be more established by the time the winter comes around. And what traditionally farmers have done, if they're going to do a cover crop, is to wait until after harvest and go in there with the drill and plant their cover crop. So some years that works out really well, and some years that makes it really difficult to get good establishment in that winter month. And then therefore they're most likely not intercepting as much of the nitrate as they could be. So we're looking at really different strategies of trying to get that cover crop in earlier, and that is looking at different methods of seeding as well, since you can't exactly go in with the drill and plant over a standing corn crop or standing soybean crop. So I have a few pictures here of some of our different methods. On the bottom, we have the highboy interseeder. Chris was talking about that. This isn't the exact unit that was used up there, but it's pretty much the same. Chris was running it up there just a couple weeks ago. That's really looking at late season, maybe a month before harvest seeding, to get that cover crop a little bit of a head start. And then once that canopy is taken off and it's getting some sunlight and harvest occurs, that crop is already established and ready to go. And then on the right, we have a Henniker interseeder that basically, I think we were aiming for around V4. So corn that basically we want to get over it before it's too tall to go over with the tractor. And then we're able to do that with that seeding unit and trying to test that to see, for one thing, what it is, how it affects the corn yield, but seeing the cover crop establishment as well. So another thing that's happening at this site, other than the cover crop and soil health work, is they're also looking at some different fertigation strategies as well. And that's something that's, you know, I said we're looking at different approaches at all three of these sites, but there are some things happening across the sites too that kind of help us tie them together and also look at some very important interactions as well. So there is the treatment list that we have that in the plot map. And this is actually the exact study that Chris was showing pictures of with the pretty good sized plot. So it's a pretty extensive study. I'm not going to delve into too many details on what the exact treatments are. If you're really interested in that, you can shoot me an email later on. So next I'll go on to the nitrogen management, nitrogen and water site. So this site, a lot of what we're looking at is different nitrogen and irrigation rates. And we're also looking at the interactions between those. So we're looking at what happens in a, say, if not only high nitrogen or high irrigation, but we're looking at the combination of doing both as well and seeing the impact that has on nitrate leaching. And we're looking at yield and economics as well for all of these sites. We're also looking at the use of nitrogen inhibitors and enhanced nitrogen products. There's been a lot of buzz around that as well. And we're also looking at timing of nitrogen application. So we're looking at split application versus all up front, and looking at several different splits as well for different timing of trying to get the nitrogen there when the crop needs it instead of putting it all out ahead of time and having more loss. And we're also looking at some different commercial nitrogen fertilizer management models and comparing that to some university strategies and some other strategies. So a lot of different comparisons and interactions going on at this site, and a lot of treatments there as well. A lot of these are different nitrogen levels. When I talk about nitrogen levels, we have enough out there to get a good curve and have a good comparison for what we're doing. So we're going from no nitrogen put on whatsoever up to, I believe, 300 pounds of nitrogen. And I think there's 5 or 6 different levels on here. So, and I showed a little bit in the previous slide, I had some pictures of the corn growing with different nitrogen rates as well. So with that, I'm going to go to the last site. That's diversified crop rotation site. And as I've said before, talking about the area's history of what crops are in here, in this area, and trying to diversify that and find things that work agronomically into the system that are kind of already here and work well for reducing the nitrate load. So one thing we're looking at is inserting winter wheat into the corn and soybean rotation. I also mentioned that these are under a pivot, as you know, Chris mentioned in the picture before, center pivot irrigation. So there is some winter wheat traditionally grown in this area, but it's a pretty low amount, and a lot of it is grown in dryland situations or marginal farmlands. So we're looking at some more higher yield irrigated potential ground as well. And we're looking at the economics of that as well. And then another thing we're looking at this site is also growing corn after several years of alfalfa, with the thought that that alfalfa will provide some nitrogen and make it so we don't have to put as much nitrogen fertilizer on that subsequent corn crop. A lot of farmers may be doing this, but they may not be taking appropriate credit of that alfalfa. So that's what we're doing for different treatments there. And I'm also going to kind of show the rotations that we've got there. So in order to do this, we're looking at every aspect of the rotation in every year. So I also want to mention as well that I should have mentioned maybe in the last slide is that we're also comparing everything to a perennial pasture being planted. So having grass roots in the ground at all times of the year, we feel that's probably a best case scenario, maybe not one that we're likely to see a lot, but it gives us a good comparison and a good benchmark to compare all of our treatments to. You also see the plot map there with different colors being different rotations. This site was actually simplified a little bit from the first year, so there's a little bit more corn in there as well, but still a lot of different things going on and some different strategies to try to work on this nitrate issue. So with that, I've got my email address there. If anybody would like to shoot a question there or put one in the chat, I think we'll have a section for questions at the end of this.
Thank you, Jeremy. And this is a great companion piece. Last but not least, we're going to call up Amy Timmerman, who's going to touch on the outreach and engagement activities around the demo farms. I mean, as you saw from Jeremy's talk, there's a lot going on up there, and connecting it to producers and other stakeholders is key. So Amy is an extension educator with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and is located in Holt and Boyd counties up in Northeast Nebraska. So Amy, over to you.
So Crystal and Chris and Jeremy gave you guys a great overview on the Bazile and all the work that is being done up in this area. But I'm going to focus more on the outreach and what we're doing on an extension outreach standpoint to get the information out about what is going on at the demonstration farms, what are we finding out from that research, and maybe sometimes we're looking at that public health and just trying to allow everybody in the area to understand and to come to better understanding about what is going on and how this impact is on them with this groundwater nitrate issue. So within the Bazile, Crystal mentioned we have a larger group called the steering committee, and there's several members of that larger group that meets once a month. But back in 2019, it has not been very long ago, in 2019, it was decided that a smaller team from that steering committee would be developed. And from that smaller team, let me back up. In that smaller team, we have approximately about 10 members that are actively involved in that smaller team. Now, we do have individuals that are on the fringes that come in as we need them, but basically that core of that communication team is 10 members. And on that team, there is a Bazile coordinator. This is an individual hired by the natural resource districts whose job is to focus on the Bazile 100%. Her name is Whitney. She spends a lot of time looking at the NRCS program and helping producers sign up for those EQIP and other NRCS type grants available to bring best management practices onto their operation. You just heard from Jeremy. Jeremy is our Bazile extension educator. This has been a fairly new position, and his job focuses a lot on incorporating, being that frontline person between the university and the 4 NRDs and providing as a point source for people to go to. Then also on this communication team, we have one representative from each of the natural resource districts. Currently, we have one vacancy right now. There's also the grant coordinator. Crystal talked about the fact that we have received funding from the Nebraska Environmental Trust Fund. We also have received funds from EPA and in the Department of Environment and Energy. So there's a grant coordinator. This individual is through the Natural Resource District, but they are on there primarily due to the fact that trying to manage all those finances and making sure we're spending the money appropriately and not overspending when we are doing outreach events. And then there's currently on our team, there's 3 active extension individuals that work in the area, myself is included. I'm a cropping and water educator, so I focus on that crop and water. There's a second extension educator that's in the area who's also in cropping and water. But our third extension educator that we have working on this team actually has a youth focus. She's a 4-H youth development educator to help us incorporate that youth component into it. So this smaller team, like I stated, was developed in 2019. In October of 2019, we did attend a training down in Atlanta called the Innovative Collaborative program. And so it was an opportunity for all of us to get to know each other, but also work on different ways on that collaborative model that Crystal showed earlier in also the pre-meeting information that she provided. But how do we look at that collaborative model? How do we move forward? And from that, this core team has been the driving force for some of the actions that have been occurring in the steering committee and in the Bazile as a whole when we look at extension and outreach. So our primarily two big meetings that we have been looking at here lately has been what we consider our field day and winter meetings. So the trick with the field days, we are hosting these directly in the demonstration plots that Jeremy just talked about. We want to provide an opportunity for the growers in the area to actually walk into the plots. Can we show them exactly what we're doing? So for 2021, we had that meeting in September. We were able to show them the variable rate irrigation. And this is also the site that we're looking at, that soil health component. So they were able to go in and look at the cover crop components, also see the drone technology, the different VRI or variable rate irrigation technologies that are being used. Besides showing that, we also bring other speakers in that are very pertinent to the area of what we're trying to do. So this year, since we were at the soil health location, we brought in a specialist from the NRCS, from the state office, to talk about soil health as a general concept. We also had an individual talking about his experience of incorporating cover crops. And then the last speaker that we had at this event is an individual who works the School of Natural Resource at UNL, is part of the Water for Food, and he's been doing a lot of hydrology work in the area where he's been actually sampling the Bazile Creek and measuring the age of the groundwater and looking at how quickly that groundwater and potential nitrate loads are coming back into that surface water. And so how fast are we seeing that nitrate movement, and trying to help explain the model on how groundwater is impacting surface water, and how some of the practices that we're looking at for best management is going to take several years for us to see that change, because from the work that Dr. Gilmore has shown is some areas of the Bazile Creek, the groundwater is over 20 years old. And so we're still looking at impacts on that groundwater to surface water that occurred 20, 30, 40 years ago. So this is a great opportunity to get people hands-on and really see what's going on. And you can see on the bottom there is a picture of the location during our field day in 2021 with the tents and individuals in attendance. The nice thing with the field day, we will state, we did this year, we do provide an opportunity for our youth to come in there. An invitation was sent out to every FFA, Future Farmers of America Club, that is offered through the schools. And we did have one school bring youth in, so the youth are getting exposed to the information that we're providing to the producers also. And then the last really big outreach meeting that we do, we offer a winter meeting every year. Typically, this is offered face-to-face. In 2021, we had to offer it virtually due to COVID restrictions. But this is an opportunity. Once again, we bring speakers in. We look at different concepts, different ideas of what's going on in the area. What are things we need to consider? What are other methods that we haven't looked at? And the nice thing for 2022 is we will have all the data from the demonstration plots will have already been calculated and analyzed for 2021 year. And all those results are going to be also shared during the winter meeting. So once again, we're trying to provide that opportunity to interact with the producers in the area and bring in that research demonstration information so we can be interactive and have a very good discussion about why are we seeing the trends that we are, and potentially look at different ways that we can make adjustments to those best management practices, or provide an opportunity to do larger on-farm research that Chris was talking about on their operations from what we're able to show them from our demonstration plots. The last big thing that we've been trying to do from this small communication group was develop a citizen action. And so this is coming from that goal that we wanted to form small local groups that will discuss specific issues. So the specific issues that we were looking at is that human health components of nitrates, youth education on nitrogen management, irrigation management, looking at agronomic solutions. Are there solutions or ideas out there that our producers have that we maybe haven't considered on a research standpoint. So what are ideas that they have, and let's try to incorporate those into on-farm. And then we don't want to forget about the homeowner urban component. Now, these are small communities, so when we say urban, we're only looking at populations of up to 2,000 people. But how do those individuals also play into this role of nitrate mitigation in the area? And so bottom line, what we're looking at is homegrown solutions. So taking a different approach, instead of it being a top-down approach of university and government officials saying, these are what you need to do, you have a problem, instead of let's get a small group of local people, them identify that, yes, this is a problem, yes, I want to do something, and they lead the charge and they come up with the solutions. So it doesn't feel like they're getting hammered on the head. And so that was the goal of the citizen action. We were kicking this off of March of 2020. We had one face-to-face meeting. The way we were setting it up is we started off with 3 community meetings, providing information about nitrates, trying to figure out what their base knowledge is about nitrates. Are they concerned about it? Sampling their own home wells. We were testing for their nitrate levels as they attended the meeting. We had one local meeting, very good reception from that, and then COVID hit. And everybody knows how that COVID impact has been detrimental on some of our components, and it has really put a halt to our citizen action. We try to do some citizen action via Zoom. It isn't effective, is what we found out. We need to be in face-to-face. We need to be around small tables, and we need to interact with people. So this past fall, winter, October, November of 2020, we tried to bring it back, but we weren't real successful because people were still very concerned about COVID and weren't comfortable coming to a face-to-face event. So we are looking at trying to revamp that, but that is a big goal of this communication group, is look at that citizen action and get that to develop. When we look at the research behind that, long term, the research has shown that you get better impacts, better adoption of new practices, but it takes a lot of time and work to facilitate those. And there's facilitation on the front end, but once the group starts to go, we have to be prepared to let go of the reins. That's the big thing when we look at citizen action. And that is something that our group is wanting to do and are going to continue to move forward with that. So that's really where we're at with our communication team at this point in time in the Bazile, and how we're kind of looking at how we extend that outreach and how do we interact with the residents of the Bazile.
Thank you, Amy. And I wanted to put a quick plug in for a great resource, for perhaps for audience members who are not as familiar with this project. The website to go to for more information is BGMA, as the acronym demonstrates, .nebraska.gov. And that site launched, I don't know, maybe a year or so ago, and just is a great clearinghouse for a lot of the things that have been discussed this morning, but also for far more information if you're interested to pursue it there. Okay, I'm going to kind of transition now into the Q&A part, just because we have about 10 or so minutes left, and there were some questions that came in early in the chat. I really like this question. It's so appropriate. Somebody wrote, how long did it take for the Bazile team to form? Sometimes, yes, collaborations like this can be painfully slow. So any tips that you might have about catalyzing these kinds of collaborations?
I volunteered to jump in, and that would have been a really great addition to my presentation, so we'll cover it. This is a great infographic that some of the NRD folks put together to talk about that timeline, because it is slow to get movement and traction. So the NRDs were collecting groundwater samples, so monitoring nitrate levels back in the mid-1980s. And so during the late 1980s, there were research studies done. So they noticed, they noticed some things they wanted to dig into. So the NRDs worked with the University of Nebraska through our conservation and survey researchers to kind of scope out what is the extent of nitrate contamination, because they had seen it. And so this was when it was first identified on the map. So they basically drew a map and they called it, at the time, it was the Bazile Triangle, because it was a triangle rather than a rectangle at the time. So that was clear back in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Oh, no, I jumped ahead. So yeah, the triangle piece was officially declared a spot in 1989. So a while ago now. So fast forward to 2000, there were some further UNL studies. This one was looking at what's the source of that nitrate. So this kind of tied it to commercial fertilizers. Fast forward to 2005. This is when the surface water piece came in. So one of those creeks within it is called the East Branch of Verdigris Creek. And that really looked at the water quality issues in that surface water. So in 2012, they kind of fully formed the Bazile Groundwater Management Area. And that's when they began working on their groundwater management plan. Then by 2014, NRCS and NDEE designated this area as part of the National Water Quality Incentive Programs. That was when its first federal designation. Then by 2016, they had finalized that plan and it was accepted through the EPA. This is when it was that first groundwater quality focused plan that could use the 319 non-point source program dollars. And so they were able to get a grant at that time in 2016. And then this one ends at 2019. That was when Jeremy's position was created. So that's a jointly funded position between the NRDs and the university. And so you've heard most of what's happened since then in these presentations. But yes, it's a very, as environmental challenges often are, it takes a while to get movement and traction.
Thanks, Crystal. Elizabeth asked about, has the project met its 5-year goal since the objectives were outlined in 2016? And I open that up to the floor.
So I will approach that one. So the 5-year goal was to start reducing nitrate loads, right? The reality is we have not met that goal of objectives. The sad news is when we look at our nitrate level loads in the Bazile area, they've actually increased over the last 5 years. And we now have another community that is now has exceeded the EPA nitrate loads and is looking at ways to manage their municipality water source. Now, it may seem like we're in a losing battle, but we need to take a look once again on how fast the nitrates are moving through the soil profile itself into that groundwater. And we are still looking at, in some areas in that Bazile area, when we look at some of the research that is being done from the Water for Food and with the School of Natural Resources, that there is still a high nitrate load in that Veda zone of the Bazile area. And that nitrogen hasn't made it there. And that's nitrogen was introduced into the system potentially up to 50 years ago. And so we're still waiting for some of those major loads to still hit. So there's a lot of complex components with it, as everybody knows, with environmental impacts and water quality, that this isn't a problem that's going to be solved overnight. And we are still going to be seeing some increases until we get that big load gone. So doesn't mean that we haven't met our goal. We are still working on it. It's just understanding the science of why we did not meet that goal.
Yeah, and to say just a slight bit more about the testing being done. So the vadose zone is the soil from the surface down to the groundwater. And so since there's this time delay that Amy was talking about, what they're trying to do instead is monitor that soil above it so that we can see those impacts sooner. Because like Amy said, it'll be quite a while before we see it in the groundwater itself. And so maybe that's not the best measure of success. So the NRDs and through some of this other funding sources, they are working with our water science lab to do testing around these community wellhead areas to really look at that upper level so they can see hopefully some quicker changes, but that we don't have the data yet to be able to say, are we having success in that, that shorter time frame? But that's kind of how they've pivoted a little bit to say, how do we more accurately measure it when we have this delay problem?
Since I'm not seeing a question emerge in the chat, I wanted to bring Christopher and Jeremy into this and just ask a quick question, since we don't have too much time remaining. Do you guys see the possibility to adopt a kind of testing ag performance solutions or TAPS program model that engages the farmers kind of in a direct way with this project? Is that something that is conceivable with the BGMA?
And the short answer is absolutely. So we did put in a grant 2 years ago with that idea in mind, and we're not successful. So some of it is just getting the grant application to match the funding source. So that's always a challenge. But the concept of being able to test ideas on a research site without having the risk on your own operation is really novel, and I think helpful, especially when it comes to some of these ideas. Because I think that's one of the big things producers face all the time is they want to do things that are environmentally sound, like reducing nitrates that are going to the groundwater. But there's also the economic challenge of meeting meeting the bottom line each year that they're growing. And so if you can provide low risk environments to test some of those things before they have to go and implement it, I think that's it would be really helpful. Jeremy, I don't know if you'd add to that, but that would be my thought.
Yeah, I think that definitely good thoughts. And there have been some small talks with myself and a few other extension educators up in the Northeast part of the state about maybe in the future trying to incorporate these into these demo sites, or maybe doing a kind of miniature version of the TAPS program at Haskell Ag Lab, which is not actually in the Bazile, but it is in Northeast Nebraska as well. But some of those talks are kind of just in the early stages, but it has definitely been something we've thought of and see a lot of potential there in that model.
Well, thank you, everybody, for being involved in this session, for participating and asking questions. And obviously a special thank you to Crystal and Amy and Christopher and Jeremy for taking time, not only during this hour, but ahead of time to prepare your presentation and slides and your thoughts.